It's a clash of legends. Judit Polgar has the white pieces against the formidable Veselin Topalov in a razor-sharp Sicilian Najdorf. Let's dive in. Polgar opens with e4, and Topalov responds with the Sicilian defense. The mainline Najdorf hits the board, a classic setup for a complex battle. Both sides develop naturally, but then Polgar signals her intent with the aggressive pawn push to g4, immediately challenging black on the king side. And here, Topalov makes the first slip. He challenges white's pawn storm directly, but this gives Polgar a lasting edge. The much stronger try was pushing the pawn to e5, after knight to f5 and pawn to g6, white's queen moves to e2, and black can simply take the knight on f5, winning a piece. But in the game, Topalov pushes his pawn to g5, and white is already significantly better. White develops the queen to e2, and after a few more moves, Polgar castles queenside. The stage is set for a classic opposite-side castling race. Black's knight retreats to d7, a passive choice that cedes even more control to white. Developing the bishop to d7 would have been a much better plan, and now Polgar gives some of the advantage back. The pawn push looks natural, but it lets Topalov back into the game. The crushing move was knight to f5. After queen to c7, white continues with pawn to h4, rook to g8, and pawn takes on g5 simply wins a pawn. Back on the board, Polgar plays pawn to f4, and while still better, the position is suddenly much less clear. The pawns are exchanged in the center, and a tense middle game begins. Both players maneuver their pieces, probing for weaknesses and improving their positions. The maneuvering continues. Polgar's knight hops to h5, putting pressure on black's kingside and forcing the dark-squared bishop all the way back to h8. And right here, Topalov makes a serious error. The knight jumps into c5, which looks active, but it's a tactical oversight that lands him in huge trouble. The only way to hold on was queen to b6. After pawn to b3 and knight to c5, bishop to c1, black can take the pawn on e4, winning material. Instead in the game, the knight leaps to c5 and Polgar has a golden opportunity to win. But she misses it. Bishop to g3 is a huge mistake from Polgar, letting black completely off the hook. The crushing move was knight to f5, which would have been decisive. Topalov can't resist grabbing the pawn with knight takes on e4, but this is an inaccuracy that gives the advantage right back to white. Queen to c7 was the way to consolidate. Polgar simply recaptures with bishop takes knight on e4, and bishop takes bishop on e4 is a fantastic move from Topalov. It's the only recapture that keeps the game alive. Here's the deep idea. If white plays rook to e1, black strikes back with pawn to d5. And after knight takes on e6, pawn takes the knight, and black is actually winning a rook. Polgar's powerful bishops create havoc. She maneuvers them to f6, forcing a response, and finally captures the bishop on h8, opening up the king side. And rook takes bishop on h8 is another brilliant find. This is the only move, correctly calculating that recapturing with the king would walk into a deadly knight check. Polgar's knight lands on f6 with check anyway, forcing the black king out to d8. With the king exposed, the h-pawn starts rolling forward. Now Topalov plays queen to c5, but this allows white to ramp up the attack unhindered. He needed to deal with the h-pawn immediately. The better plan was pawn to h5, rook to e1, queen to c5, pawn takes pawn on h5, rook takes pawn on h5, but in the game, queen to c5 allows Polgar to get her attack rolling. Polgar pushes the pawn to h5. It's a very strong move, though slightly imprecise. White is still completely winning. A tactical skirmish erupts. Black's bishop darts back to h7, and after white's queen moves, the bishop snaps off the pawn on c2 with check, forcing a recapture. Queen takes the knight on c2 with check. An excellent move, and in fact the only one that keeps black in the game, fighting for survival. White's king calmly steps away to a1, and this is a decisive error. The rook swings to c4, but it walks right into a deadly knight fork. Defending with the other rook was absolutely essential. The correct move was rook to f8. Then, after knight to d5 check, pawn to f6 blocks, the knight can take on f6, but the rook slides to f7 to defend. But back in the game, rook to c4 is played, and now white has a winning attack. Polgar plays knight to e4 with check. It's not the most precise continuation, but white's position is so overwhelming it doesn't matter. The king steps to c7. This just makes white's job easier, as moving to d7 would have put up more resistance. The knight grabs the pawn on d6, continuing the relentless assault, and now rook to f4, another inaccuracy that loses on the spot. This move allows a forced queen check sequence that will hunt the king down. The only try was knight to d3. After knight takes the rook, pawn recaptures, queen to f6, and the rook comes back to d8 to defend. But after the move played, rook to f4, Polgar has a forced win. And there it is, queen to e7, check. A brilliant and precise move, the beginning of the end for the black king. The king is forced to b6, stepping deeper into the mating net, and queen to b7 check. Another fantastic move from Polgar, who is playing with perfect accuracy, forcing the king to the edge of the board. The king runs to a5. A great move because it's the only legal one. Queen to a7. Polgar continues the hunt with another precise move, tightening the net around the exposed king. And Topalov tries a desperate pawn push to b4, but Polgar calmly brings her last attacker into the game, rook to e1, and this is the final game-losing blunder. Knight to f3 looks to block lines, but it allows a forced mate. The only way to prolong the fight was pawn to f6, knight to b7, check king to b5, rook to c1, rook to f2. But in the game, knight to f3 is played, and white has a mate in 11. Unbelievable. With a forced mate on the board, Polgar blunders. Rook to c1 is a shocking mistake that lets the win slip away completely. The winning move was clear. Knight to b7, check. After king to b5, rook to d6 attacks the queen, queen to c6, and rook takes the queen on c6, winning easily. But instead, she played rook to c1, and suddenly black is back in the game. But Topalov doesn't find the best reply. Knight takes the rook on e1 is an inaccuracy. Rook to e4 would have posed far more problems, and Polgar is right back on track. Rook takes the queen on c2 is a great move, securing a winning material advantage once again. Knight recaptures the rook on c2 with check, a great move, the best practical try in what is now a hopeless position. The white king simply sidesteps the check to b1, and this is the final mistake of the game. Knight to d4 allows a swift and brutal checkmate. The only way to continue was a desperate check of his own. He had to play knight to a3 check. After pawn takes knight, the b-pawn recaptures, then queen to c1 check, and the king runs to a4. But after the move in the game, knight to d4, Polgar has a forced mate in 3, and she finds it. Knight to b7 check begins the final combination. The king is forced to b5. And queen to c5 check, a fantastic final move, forcing resignation. And here, Veselin Topalov resigns, a chaotic and brilliant victory for Judit Polgar. Topalov saw that checkmate was unavoidable. Here's what would have happened. The king is forced to a4, and queen to a5 is checkmate.